The night folds down like a lid over the Ardennes, and the forest holds its breath. December 20th, 1944. Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. A wind of iron moves through the trees, and the snow shows the seams of fresh boot prints where patrols have felt their way back to lines that were certain yesterday and uncertain now. In the black between flares, a German forward observer steadies his glasses, counting battery flashes, pacing along the far slope the way a man might count heartbeats. He has learned the rhythm of American artillery, a first bracket, a correction, a tightening until the world narrows to a field of detonations stitched into the earth. But the first bursts arrive wrong. They don't gouge craters or chew the trunks at waist height. They bloom in the air, small suns that snap open above the column, above the hedgerow, above the shallow ditch where a squad has folded itself into the land. A whiteness of shredded bark, a fine gray snow that is not snow at all, and then the fragments descend as if gravity has been sharpened. He says it softly, not for drama, but because language must make room for fear. They are bursting over us. The plan that carried him here had been an exercise in willpower disguised as a map. Drive through the seam, outrun the calendar, cross the Meuse, reach Antwerp, break the front's spine before weather clears and Allied aircraft come back to count the roads. In the first days it made a kind of bitter sense. Armor pushed through pine corridors, villages turned into punctuation marks that meant fuel and time and the deep snow-covered mistakes as well as footprints. Yet even where momentum held, the air learned something new. Shells seemed to choose their height. Darkness stopped helping. The old answers dig, disperse, hug the trunks, wait for the crash on the ground, and then lift your head, stopped working because the killing now happened in the space a man must breathe. The observer notes the effect and sends it upward with the economy war demands. Somewhere behind him, messages are piling up that all say the same thing differently. Overhead is the most dangerous direction. There had been rumors of a device the way there are always rumors among soldiers about the next weapon that will make old habits obsolete. He had heard that the Americans used it at sea where fallen secrets drown, and that it belonged to the geometry of clean sky and aircraft wings, not to this spoiled wilderness. He had heard that it was a fuse with a mind, a radio that listened for its own voice and decided in the space between blast and gravity how high to end a life. But rumors are comfort when they stay rumors. They let a man pretend that if he keeps his body inside the rules of yesterday, he will live through today. Tonight the rumor is a fact that arrives as metal rain. A squad that would have been safe under branches is shredded by treetop bursts. A gun crew that would have been protected by its parapet is cut from above. The road itself becomes a gallery where each halted vehicle draws a circle of death in the air. The observer watches the blossoms step down a slope like a god counting, and the counting ends where his company begins. The American guns are not everywhere, but they move like they are. In the distance, a battery speaks in a disciplined cadence that tells of maps and firing tables of survey stakes, bitten into frozen ground of radios that bring steel as fast as a voice can shape a grid. There is no hysteria in that cadence, only process. The Germans have their own process, road nets, fuel priorities, the arithmetic of armor. But tonight, the process that matters belongs to the side able to turn time into fire and fire into airburst. He has seen good barrages and bad, hurried ones that sprayed earth, and careful ones that stitched craters into patterns you could trace with your finger on a map. This is different because it refuses the ground. It erases the idea of shelter and writes new rules across the negative space above men. He tries to imagine the device in the nose small as a closed fist asleep for a distance, so it won't betray the gun that flung it, waking, to ask the snow and trees a yes or no question about proximity, answering with a thyratron spark that turns metal thin and fast and everywhere at once. But imagination is a luxury. He drops the glasses and calls corrections by habit, knowing the corrections are already late. A rocket flare lifts, and the forest becomes a theater of vertical things, trunks, smoke, pillars, the hanging glow of fresh bursts, snow drifting in sheets like stage curtains. He sees medics move with that rigid grace of men who have learned to step where fragments have already fallen. He sees a machine gun team crouched in a shallow scrape that would have been clever yesterday and foolish now. He tries to measure the gap between what he knew and what is true, and discovers that the gap is exactly the height at which the shells are breaking. When the flare dies, the world returns to black, but the lesson does not unlearn itself. Somewhere ahead, Bastogne is becoming a word that means time, and to the north, an American ridge is turning into a hinge that refuses to swing. None of that belongs to him yet. What belongs to him is the line he wrote at the top of his log, the one that will survive the night and recur like a refrain at the end of this story, because some sentences once spoken do not go away, they are bursting over us. They called it a winter solved by arithmetic. The arithmetic on the German side was simple, brutal, and unforgiving fuel in liters against kilometers to Antwerp road capacity, against the appetite of a corps, bridges strong enough to carry panthers against villages too small to turn them. Terrain conspired with the plan, offering pine corridors that hid columns and also funneled them into single files where a stalled half-track could halt a regiment. Weather did its part, lowering the ceiling and grounding the Allied eyes that had patrolled the roads since summer. The offensive's heartbeat was distance converted to time converted to surprise. Every hour gained before the skies cleared was a kind of currency. That was the pre-war dream of operational art, transposed into a bar of ice and steel. It would have worked better if the enemy's artillery still obeyed the old rules of shelter and ground. It would have worked better if the winter forest were not about to learn a new number. On the American side, the arithmetic was different and no less cold. They could not be everywhere at once, so they learned to be present as fire. A radio net that reached from foxhole to fire direction center made opinions into coordinates, coordinates into angles, angles into steel. Batteries that would once have stitched craters into the earth were now told to aim for a volume of air because somebody had finally been allowed to screw into a shell nose the device that the sea had kept secret. The men who used it did not say its name out loud without pausing. They called it VT variable time and let the vagueness keep faith with the need to protect a truth that could still be ruined if a clean specimen fell into enemy hands. The truth was disarmingly plain. If a shell could sense how far it was from the world, it could choose to end itself at a height that made fragments more democratic, less wasted on soil, and more invested in the open air where men must move and breathe. The first hard value slid across the winter like a quiet verdict bursts that tended to happen in the neighborhood of 40 feet over ground, high enough to spread, low enough to bite. The second was a promise to the gunners themselves, a dead zone of travel, after firing roughly half a kilometer, during which the fuse would not wake so no premature spark could betray the battery. Numbers like that are not poetry. They are the kind of facts that make a doctrine. Stakes followed the numbers, the way ice follows the night. For the Germans, the old shelter logic was collapsing. Trenches, shallow scrapes, tree trunks used as shields, all the places where a man pressed himself flat and trusted the ground became risky, not because the earth had failed, but because the sky had been conscripted. A platoon moving along a hedgerow discovered that dispersion only looked clever when the enemy's energy was focused on points. A ring of fragments descending from a hanging burst did not much care about gaps between men. Road columns learned that darkness no longer covered a halt, because the best time to catch an engine line was the moment when it compressed itself against the smallest obstacle. The tall firs that once felt like roof beams now acted like mirrors for radio energy, convincing the shell to break higher and punish the very canopy that was supposed to protect. Each of these was a local lesson paid for in screams and splinters, but together they wrote a strategic bill. Every pause under open air was now a roll of dice with too many sides. For the Americans, the stakes were mirror-shaped. If the device worked, and if the net held a thin defensive line, could act heavy. A ridge could be worth a division more than it looked, not because the men on it were superhuman, but because a battalion of guns miles away could be scheduled into the sky over any coordinate that a calm voice could describe. The word scheduled mattered. They had taught their batteries a trick called time-on-target corrections, and charge tables bent so that shells from scattered positions would arrive together, a single hard punch instead of a scatter of taps. Before VT, that punch gouged the ground. After VT, it hung above the heads of men who believed the ground was their friend. To a staff officer, this solved a logistics problem otherwise measured in railcars of ammunition, because blasts in air gave more effect per round than craters in snow. To a man lying in a foxhole on a ridge that stood in the way of an army, it solved a different problem. How to feel like someone much larger was standing behind him. Constraints made both sides honest. The German columns were tied to roads that pinched through villages with names too small for maps. Fuel was a metronome each kilometer, a click closer to the moment when a careful staff estimate became an ugly discovery at a crossroads. Any doctrine that relied on compression bridge approaches, village entries, forest rides, now risked punishment from above. The Americans had their own scarcity. VT fuses were precious, guarded, not thrown at every map square as if they grew on trees. Commanders husbanded them for the moments when the arithmetic promised the highest return, a tree line concealing an attack formation, a river crossing in darkness, a traffic jam that some unlucky pioneer company could not clear fast enough. Secrecy sat in every decision. They wanted the effect. They also wanted the enemy never to hold an intact example long enough to study. That is why the device had lived at sea first. That is why even now batteries mixed ordinary fuses with the new ones, confounding pattern recognition and stretching supply. Then they realized the winter had added another variable sound. Snow tamps at trees, trap it bursts in air, write a new acoustic grammar that makes correction trickier and terror quicker. German forward observers accustomed to counting seconds between flash and impact found their timing betrayed because the impact now floated a blossom of pressure arriving with a bright snap that could be close or far and still feel equally personal. American FDC crews learned too that treetops and ravines could nudge burst heights a little higher or lower than the tables predicted, that the best call for fire language included notes about canopy and slope, not just grids. This is how a weapon becomes a system: radios that do not fail in cold, men who can think in maps under stress, a factory line that sends more noses east each week than the week before, and a doctrine that treats time as the scarce resource that decides battles. At ground level, the stakes simplified themselves. Move fast or the sky will find you. Disperse in 3 dimensions, not just across the map. Accept that yesterday's safe places are today's killing fields. For one side, the lesson made a gamble harder to cash. For the other, it turned a thin defense into a hinge the enemy could not break. The observer who will end this story with the same sentence that opened it does not know any of the procurement curves or the production totals. He does not need them. He only knows that somewhere behind the ridge a voice speaks, and moments later the air answers not with a crater, but with a decision hanging 40 feet above his men. Before the forest learned fear, the device learned to think. Not in language, not in strategy, but in a narrow, reliable way that a shell could understand, measure distance with radio, and make a decision at speed. Inside the blunt plastic nose sat a transmitter no bigger than a thumb bone, a receiver that listened for its own whisper coming back off the world, a tiny vacuum tube that could switch faster than a man could blink, and a reserve battery that woke only after violence had flung the projectile downrange. Set back, the sudden crush of acceleration armed the battery. Spin stabilized the little antennas slanted behind the ogive. A simple, stubborn circuit waited until its echo changed pitch, the way a passing motorcycle's note slides by your ear. That shift was the answer to the only question the fuse knew how to ask: are we close enough to matter? If yes, a thyratron fired a detonator, woke the main charge, and steel that would have buried itself in snow instead burst into a cloud of jagged arithmetic above the target's lungs. The geometry was the point. Ground bursts waste half their energy on the earth that does not bleed. Airbursts spend nearly all of it on the men who must breathe. The Americans wanted an average break in the low tens of feet above the surface, high enough to widen the fragment cone, low enough for splinters to arrive with speed and angle that defeat helmets and shallow scrapes. The fuse did not count trees, but trees answered it. A dense canopy could make the circuit believe the ground was higher than it was, nudging bursts up toward treetop and turning every branch into a secondary weapon. In open fields, a hedgerow might be the only reflector. In villages, walls and vehicles created geometry that made the sky bloom where men paused. Nothing mystical lived in the nose, only timing and a short patience, but that was sufficient to translate electronics into weather for the enemy. A cartridge on a chart is a number. A battery on frozen ground is a process. Behind each burst sat a chain of habits taught by repetition until they became reflex. A forward observer's voice dry and specific over a cold radio. An aiming circle biting into ice as surveyors lock bearings. A fire direction center turning a pair of grid coordinates into charge tables, quadrant elevation deflection, and a schedule. Gun crews snapping the fuse from its can, checking safety clips, slamming the round home. Time on target was the quiet miracle here. Guns miles apart, each with its own powder temperature and barrel wear, and wind solved their parts of the equation so that all their shells fell in the same 3-second window. Earlier in the war, that harmony carved neat rings of dirt. Now it hung in the air like a decision made by a committee that never met. The physics cared nothing for doctrine, but doctrine learned from physics. Fragment velocity at detonation is a savage constant. Spread and density are the variables men can influence. If a 105mm battery firing 3 rounds per tube in time on target could fill a rectangle of sky with enough steel to touch every face turned upward, then the value of a pause on a road or a regimental form-up in a clearing changed from risky to prohibitive. If a 155mm section slower to load, heavier to move, put fewer larger bursts across a tree line, the fragments carried farther laterally and punished men who thought distance from the aiming point was safety. The gun line did not need to overthink any of this. It only needed to accept that fuses which asked their own range questions made every battery heavier than its weight and every call for fire cheaper than before. Trust arrived slowly and then all at once. At first the shells were rationed for high-return moments, river crossings at night, choked lanes where a knocked-out half-track could turn a brigade into a queue woodlines that hid a battalion's worth of silhouettes. Crews mixed old fuses with new both to mask the pattern and to keep supply honest. Gunners learned the device's manners, arming distance measured in the better part of half a kilometer after muzzle exit. A stubborn immunity to premature bursts over the gun pit. The rare misbehavior when wet snow caked the noses, a problem solved with a rag and a sergeant's voice. Forward observers learned to report what the fuse could not see on a map canopy. Height slope, the glint of frozen river ice that might alter the echo. Fire direction learned to shave or add charge to nudge the breakpoint closer to the sweet band. None of this felt like magic. It felt like artillery admitting that the space above a man is as much terrain as the ground under him. On the other side of the tree line, the lesson wrote itself into bodies. A German squad that would once have hugged a parapet now discovered the safer place was tight against a trunk, where the downward cone thinned, or deep in a cellar, if a village could be reached at a sprint. Dispersal across a map mattered less than dispersal in depth. 2 meters of vertical cover could mean more than 20 of horizontal spacing. Then they realized the old grammar of movement: wait for the ground impacts to walk past, and rise in the pause no longer parsed, because the air did not walk. It arrived all at once and from angles the ear could not correctly time. The observer's stopwatch became less useful than his instinct for where Americans were likely to schedule sky rather than soil. In that instinct lived a new kind of fear, the kind that makes a man hurry past an open place not because he sees a muzzle flash, but because he imagines one. Factories far behind the snow translated theory into countable things. Wooden crates showing up in depots with fresh noses cushioned like eggs. Inspection benches where women with magnifiers checked solder joints no wider than a pencil line. Test bays where technicians fired instrumented dummies across short ranges to verify arming distance and self-destruct if no echo ever came. A fuse that woke too early could kill its own battery. A fuse that never woke would bury its fragments uselessly. Between those errors was a narrow road. The device learned to walk with a reliability good enough that officers who had distrusted radios and shells began to plan around them. There were limits, and the Americans, cold, pragmatic, respected them. Not every target deserved height. Not every burst needed to be clever. Snow that absorbed fragments, ice that reflected them. Oddly funked that fooled echoes, winter invented petty countermeasures without consulting Berlin. And yet the net effect held. The doctrine that grew in the frost was simple enough to remember under fire: turn time into fire. Turn fire into air. Punish pauses. Make the sky dangerous. And once both sides believed it, the battle narrowed to a contest of who could move without compressing, Who could defend without presenting a surface to the weapon that only measured surfaces? By the time the forest learned the full name of what was killing it, it was already too late to matter. The device did not care what men called it. It knew only how to ask its question and when to answer, and that was enough to change the shape of safety in a winter where safety had always been a rumor. They tested hypotheses the way soldiers always do by walking into them. In the first days, the bursts felt like an omen. By the week's middle, they behaved like policy. A Kampfgruppe nosed along a sunken lane toward a bridge that existed more in orders than on any map, half-tracks stacked nose-to-tail engines idling in the discipline of darkness. One pioneer section dismounted to worry at a felled tree, the sort of obstacle that costs 5 minutes, when 5 minutes are free, and a company when they are not. The first shells announced themselves as a familiar bracket, and men flattened in practiced obedience. Then the air opened instead of the earth. White slivers of fur scissored down among black fragments. Canvas covers shredded. Idling motors coughed and died. The sergeant, who had timed American barrages all summer to survive them, counted wrong on purpose, anything to slow the trick his ear was playing, and discovered there was nothing to count. It arrived together in height, as if a lid had been slammed. Elsewhere, the sky found different work. At a village that was really just a cross of 2 streets, a company paused to sort itself for a push through a woodlot. The plan was sound. One element would slide left along gardens walled with fieldstones. Another would cross a frozen orchard and take the tree line on its narrow face. Someone had seen movement on the far slope, and someone else had doubted it, and in that argument, the schedule for death matured. The shells broke over the lane where the platoon commander had chosen to rally, a perfect rectangle of air that glittered with fragments so dense a man could have sketched the borders with his glove. The orchard received a second volley, 3 bursts stepping together like a drummer's roll. The company moved anyway, because the offensive was not a suggestion, but the survivors learned a new grammar. If you cannot leave quickly, leave vertically. Cellars, culverts, the dark under stairwells, anything that turned the cone of steel into edges that could be outflanked by breath. Captures were poor and instructive. A patrol sent back at dawn to feel the edges of an American battery's perimeter found only the administrative ghost of violence, tire tracks frozen into ruts, cigarette butts, a clipped paper tag from a Fuze crate, and the crooked teeth of survey stakes knocked flat by departing trucks. One shell that had buried itself without breaking was levered out of the snow. Its nose shattered to opaque pieces that refused to explain themselves. A second, found in a shallow drift by a hedgerow, had died clean from self-destruct, without revealing anything but that somebody clever had planned for failure. An engineer captain, with the right patience, pried bent metal and glass from the broken noses and arranged the fragments on a poncho, as if the device might reassemble itself out of respect. A small coil, a tube with its pinched waist, shattered a battery pack that had eaten itself to exhaustion enough to confirm a radio lived there, not enough to learn how it listened. He wrote the obvious in a notebook that would be washed by thaw before anyone read it. It decides the height, and we do not. Fieldcraft tried to keep up. Orders that once began dig-dispersed camouflage added a 4th imperative: roof. A shallow scrape topped with logs and earth bought survival not from concussion, but from angles. Trunks were friends. The worst place was the pretty place, an open lane under clean branches, the sort of corridor that makes a column feel efficient until the sky remembers it. Platoons moved as shadows across walls, not straight lines across fields. Leaders began to read the map for canopy and slope as much as contour and road. Then they realized that every plan which required compression, bridge approaches, village entries, a right turn off a forest ride had become a kind of invitation. The old penalty for traffic was delay. The new penalty was death arranged by appointment. The Americans were learning too, and you could hear it in how fast the corrections arrived. A first salvo would break a little high over heavy trees, the next a hair lower, the third, exactly in the unseen pocket, where men who thought they had solved the problem were breathing hard. Fire direction posts kept their stoves low, so the radios would not sweat and fail. Powder temperature corrections were read with the same care as a password at a sentry point. Time on target ceased to be a trick and became the default courtesy. Guns that had nothing in common but caliber worked to a schedule that laid 3 rounds per tube into the same 4-second window, a handful of moments that felt to those below like one decision wearing many faces. When weather lifted for a few hours and aircraft wrote their own arguments across the forest, the ground bursts did not stop. They layered. A road caught by fighter bombers at a village exit would receive the second paragraph from artillery at the next bend, written in steel commas that hung above stalled roofs. The winter added pressure everywhere and favored the side that metabolized pressure into process. At the Sour, a crossing rehearsed by hand over sand tables dissolved under airbursts whose fragments hissed into the water and ricocheted off ice, punishing the waiting as much as the moving. At Elsenborn, the line that looked thin on a situation map proved heavy in the only unit of measure that matters to an attacker: how long it takes to get through alive. In Bastogne, the woodlines that promised cover to infiltrators turned treacherous when the canopy answered to radio and taught the shells to break where splinters could fight for the Americans. None of these incidents decided the offensive by themselves, but together they tightened a vice whose handles were time and altitude. The closest anyone came to comfort was a rumor of a countermeasure. Men spoke of dragging branches across lanes to change the echo of hanging wire to confuse distance of smudging noses with mud. Some of it worked once by coincidence and failed twice by physics. The device did not think like a man. It only asked the world one question and believed the answer with machine innocence. The only consistently useful tactic was speed. Because there is no echo from a place you do not occupy long enough to be measured. That truth passed from squad to company to regiment, changed the posture of attack from deliberate to predatory when it could, and from confident to cautious when it could not. By week's end, the observer who had begun by counting flashes had stopped counting and started listening for silence, because silence meant the pause between schedules, and the pause was the only time the ground felt like ground again. He flipped through his log and found his own words repeating with the laziness of an old prayer. The entries were dated, the places laid out in strings that would look tidy to a staff officer's eye, but the line that mattered was the one he had written the first night, and would write again without thinking. He understood now that it was not a metaphor. It was a measurement. They are bursting over us. Reliability is a word no one loves until winter makes it the only thing that matters. The device did not earn its place on a ridge by being clever in a laboratory. It earned it by waking when it should, sleeping when it must, and dying harmlessly when the world gave it nothing to hear. In practice, that meant a reserve battery that did not waste itself during the gun's concussion, but came alive only after setback and spin had proved the shell was truly in flight. It meant a tiny tube that would switch the instant the echo changed pitch, not before and not late thousands of times in a factory test bay before a single one rode out into the snow. It meant a habit of self-destruct when the echo never came over a river say or an empty field, so that curiosity would not survive as salvage. A weapon with a mind had to show good manners. The winter accepted it, because round after round it behaved. Trust grew where behavior repeated. In the gun pits, the crewmen learned the device's small vices, and the tricks that cured them: wipe the nose if wet snow cakes, keep the fuse cans warm under a tarp. Watch powder temperature. Like a priest watches a clock, because a schedule is a promise, and promises are easy to break when fingers are numb. On the line of maps, the fire direction, men, the ones who made language into angles, stopped treating VT as a special occasion and started planning for it the way you plan for weather. A crossing in darkness. Mix the lot point. Detonating to tear lanes in wire and roots, mechanical time to rattle nerves up in the branches, and the proximity noses to turn the pause into punishment. A road jam you can hear on a listening set the charge for a sweet band above the hedges and count backward from the report time so that the sky is occupied when the column must be. The doctrine didn't change all at once. It thickened. The old truths remained: gun lines dispersed, survey, exact time on target, holy. But each truth now carried a second clause about the space above men. Radios enforced those clauses. A net that ran from foxhole to battery made the Americans seem bigger than they were, and winter made the net more honest, because the men who spoke on it had nothing else to rely on. The little sets in the snow could say we hear tracks on the lane beyond the orchard, or we have muzzle flashes along the cut in the tree line. Those sentences, short and calm, traveled up to a tent that smelled of oil stoves and pencil shavings, where a clerk wrote figures while a lieutenant mumbled charge tables under his breath. The answer traveled back down as numbers and minutes. None of the voices were heroic. All of them were present. In that presence lived the secret of why height mattered when steel could be scheduled into the air over a coordinate that existed only as words. War stopped being a contest of who held ground and started being a contest of who could make the sky arrive on time. On the German side, radios existed, but they did not saturate. Squads often argued with the map and with each other more than with a net. Runners carried messages with their lungs. Flares spoke in crude colors. A field telephone line strung along a hedgerow told the enemy as much as it told the battalion that paid for it. Fuel talked louder than any set. Petrol set the rhythm of life road discipline that punished initiative cues, that punished courage priorities, that made sense in a staff tent and turned cruel at the first knocked-out vehicle. Doctrine had the right words for dispersion and momentum, but roads have a way of writing doctrine over in their own hand. Every plan that required compression, bridge approaches, village entries, a turn from one forest ride to another, created the very geometry the device preferred. It did not matter that men knew the rule. Winter made them obey the road instead. Reliability in the field is also the absence of betrayal. The Fuze had to ignore the world until the world became important, and that meant an arming distance long enough to keep gun crews safe, whether the battery was a section tucked under trees or a whole battalion in staggered bays. It meant a circuit that did not spasm at the first sleet pellet or flinch at the glare off frozen water. When it misbehaved, the misbehavior had a pattern. Men could manage noses that glazed over in wet snow bursts a little high under heavy canopy, and because the pattern held, the solutions held. Wipe, adjust charge, nudge elevation to bend the brake down into the killing band. The most seductive thing about a new tool is the way it tempts you to forgive its sins. The Americans did not forgive. They corrected, rehearsed, logged, folded the lessons back into the process until the process itself became the weapon. Training did not look like banners and speeches. It looked like boredom beaten into fluency. A forward observer learned to describe a place in a single breath hedge line short of the orchard gap, left of the lane canopy about 30 feet. A chief of section learned the rhythm of his crew in mittens so the third round could be on the tray before the time on target table said it was due. A battery commander learned that asking for too much from the Fuze at once height, density, width could waste it, and that a few clever bursts at the right instant were worth more than a heap of cleverness spread thin. The field punished greed. The field rewarded judgment. Doctrine met reality most nakedly at night crossings. Rivers had always been ambushes in slow motion. Now they became experiments in altitude. Engineers with rubber boats and poles learned that the worst danger arrived not from the far bank, but from the air over their own assembly points. Officers rehearsed in barns with chalk on floors learned to cut the stages into shorter pieces to avoid the smooth rectangle of men and rubber that draws a rectangle of fragments above it. When they could, they asked for a sequence, a slab of point detonating to frighten wood and wire on the opposite shore. The VT bursts immediately over their own near-bank assembly area to break up the counter-barrage forming in the trees, and then a silence as absolute as a held breath while the first boats slid. It was ugly, and it worked more often than it failed, and the device did not care which side wrote the after-action report. Fuel always dragged the German plan down to its ankles. Speed would have been armor against height, but speed eats petrol, and petrol ran out at the worst places, a crest where the next town is visible, but the road is narrow, a crossroad where no one remembers who has right-of-way, a bridge where weight tables become arguments. Waiting, which had once been merely dangerous, became lethal because the pause created a volume of air the enemy could rent for a minute with math. Officers who had preached momentum now found themselves preaching caution, and caution lengthened the pauses that summoned the sky. The circle tightened slow because of fuel compressed, because of roads punished, because of compression slower, because of punishment. By the middle of the campaign, the device had disappeared into the way things were done. That was the final proof that it worked in the wild. Men stopped saying VT except in supply conversations, the way you talk about oil and rations. In logs and whispers they spoke instead about effects the orchard that could not be used twice, the lane that felt haunted, the woodlot that punished any group larger than a squad. The Americans had turned time into fire, and fire into air often enough that even rumor could not comfort the enemy. Somewhere a German engineer still arranged broken noses on a poncho and tried to will them into a secret. Somewhere a gun crew wiped snow from a plastic cap and set elevation by memory. Between them, winter drew a hard conclusion that no one could argue with. If you must pause under the open, do not pause long, and if you must dig a roof. The sky had learned to make decisions, and men were learning to live around those decisions or not at all. They did not name the turning point when it happened. No staff briefing drew a circle on a map and called it decisive. It arrived at night, like everything else in this campaign, woven of cold and habit, and a new arithmetic that punished pauses. A regiment funneled toward a river whose banks were lined with leafless willows, the color of old bone. The plan was deliberate, and therefore vulnerable assault groups moving down farm tracks, engineers with rubber boats waiting in the lee of barns, machine guns emplaced to comb the far bank once the first wave bit. It would have been textbook in another winter. Here the textbook met a number. The first shells did not search. They arrived already solved 3 volleys in a span small enough to be counted on a single held breath. One raked the near bank assembly point where the boats were shouldered, one hung over the foot of the track, where squads stacked 2 deep against a stile. One stepped out over the river itself and filled the air above the first black shapes pushing water. The officers shouted to move not because moving would stop the bursts, but because stillness had become the worst place to be. Then they realized the river was not the obstacle anymore. Time was. The metric spread like a rumor and then like a rule. Time on target had been a phrase. Now it was experienced as a few seconds that felt like a lid closing. Men who survived began telling each other to listen for the empty between schedules and to cross during that pocket, as if it were a bridge made of silence. It was not courage that changed. Courage had always been there. It was the understanding that the battle was decided in windows that could be measured. The American habit of scheduling the sky turned every German hesitation into a bill, and the bill was due at the rate of 1 barrage per correction cycle. A battalion commander scratched the math into his notebook with a pencil too stiff to write easily in the cold. If the pause at a choke point lasted longer than the interval between a call for fire and the first bursts, the choke point ceased to be a place and became a sentence. Along the ridge to the north, the hinge refused to swing. Company logs recorded the same complaint in different handwriting columns that tried to mass for a short rush, were broken not by the depth of the defense in front of them, but by the height of air over them. Reports described a quality of artillery that sounded impossible until you saw it. Corrections arriving so quickly that a first bracket that felt survivable transformed into a perfect canopy on the next minute, as if the battery itself had learned the contours of the ground by touch. There were technical reasons for this survey lines bitten into frozen earth and kept true radios that did not sulk in the cold. A fire direction center that treated powder temperatures like gospel. But the reasons did not matter to the men under the bursts. What mattered was the repeatability. When a weapon behaves the same way enough times in a row, doctrine takes its shape from the behavior. The Germans adjusted more scouts sent ahead, more faith placed in cellars rather than hedgerows, more desperation in the way officers demanded speed from machines that had run short of petrol. The problem was that each adjustment touched the road net, and the road net always answered with delay. The winter offered a single reprieve and took it back. For a few days, the sky cleared, and aircraft wrote their old dominance across the forest, ripping at convoys that had learned to drive at night, strafing crossroad towns where direction signs had been turned by helpful locals or angry ones. In another campaign, this would have been the clean punctuation that ends a paragraph. Here it became a layer. The ground bursts did not stop when the fighters came. They synchronized with them. A column that survived the pass of rockets and 20mm miss at the edge of a village found itself under airbursts at the next bend, as if someone had considered not just where vehicles would be, but when and rented that wedge of air for the necessary seconds. Then they realized they were losing the calendar as well as the ground. The word that hurt most was ordinary. The device had been a rumor when it lived at sea, a secret when it first arrived on land, a shock the first nights it taught the forest to fear overhead. By the final week of December, it had become ordinary, and ordinary was the worst fate an enemy innovation could suffer because it meant the other side had metabolized it into process. The Americans were no longer using VT in the dramatic way a staff plan uses a special capability. They were simply firing artillery as if the air were a surface that could be struck with intention. Their supply sergeants guarded crates of noses as carefully as they guarded rations. Their battery commanders mixed smart bursts with dumb. Their observers spoke in a language that included notes about canopy height and slope angle, and all of it produced a predictability that favored them. Predictability in war is a word that usually punishes the predictable. Here it punished the opposite. The Germans were the ones forced into improvisation at every choke and turn. The Americans were the ones whose method prospered under pressure. There was a day whose date will look important in histories, because other things happened around it, because a famous pocket was relieved, and a road that had been a fuse burned all the way down to a town that did not surrender. But the men at the edges did not feel history. They felt a new kind of inevitability. The German observer who had counted flashes in the first pages of his notebook now counted the time between last safe movement and first expected bursts. He found himself calculating the price of small errors, a driver who double-clutched at the wrong turn, a pioneer who took 30 seconds too long to cut a wire, an NCO who waited on a hedge corner to gather two squads into one before a dash. Each fragment of delay invited a rectangle of sky to be filled. When speed was achieved, survival followed. When speed failed, the air made the argument. The metric hardened into a lesson men could say in a sentence without numbers. Do not present the road with a mass. Do not present the air with a pause. Accept that the safest direction is not down, but through. It was not elegance. It was hunger. Units that could still move in small packets and scatter vertically through buildings and cellars found ways to continue. Units that needed the old confidence of marching in files and aligning on recognizable places discovered that places were the enemy now. A strange calm set in among those who grasped it. They stopped waiting for the old relief, a lull in ground impacts, the chance to lift a head and shout a correction, and started listening for the new relief, the few seconds between schedules when the world seemed to inhale. That was the inflection, though no one named it. Not a hill taken, not a town lost, but a recognition shared across a front that the battle's currency had changed. The men who marched into the Ardennes had believed the ground would decide as it always had, ridges, bridges, clearings, crossroads. The men who fought their way out understood that the decisive terrain had slid upward into the first 40 feet of air above any place where soldiers gathered. Once a truth like that enters the bones of an army, it does not leave quickly. The observer, closing his notebook with fingers burn-scarred by cold, did not write a flourish. He wrote the line he had written before, not as fear now, but as fact, because facts are the only things that survive the snow. They are bursting over us. The winter did not end with a single door closing. It thinned 1 hour at a time until men realized they were breathing air that no longer bit. The map changed its verbs first. Bastogne, held then was relieved on December 26, 1944, and the ring of roads that had once been a fuse became lines of supply again. North along Elsenborn Ridge, the hinge that never swung hardened into proof that sometimes a defense is not thick but precise. Patrols found shell splinters frozen into tree bark in patterns like handwriting, and realized those patterns had decided where units lived and where they did not. In the south, the river names that had been punishments, the Sour, the Hour, the Psalm, returned to being geography. Diaries that had written fear in the second person switched back to the first. The change was not sentimental. It was administrative, which in war is the only kind that lasts. Afterward, the questions arrived the way they always do when cold turns to paperwork. What had stopped the offensive was not a single miracle, but a conspiracy of limits, fuel and roads and weather and resistance. But inside that conspiracy, something had shifted the arithmetic. Airburst had made altitude into terrain, and once an army learns to fight for terrain it cannot see, it does not unlearn it. American units that had rationed their new noses in December began planning around them in January. Forward observers folded canopy and slope into their ordinary language as casually as range and bearing. Fire direction centers treated height of burst like another angle to solve rather than a gift to be requested. The weapon had escaped its secrecy by the only honorable route it became procedure. The Germans wrote their own after-action understanding with the soldiers' modesty. They had watched artillery become punctual enough to schedule a crossing to the second and elastic. Enough to bend burst height to a woodline. They had learned to hug trunks and cellars to move between schedules rather than between craters to fear the pause more than the sprint. They carried home an idea rather than a device because most of the broken noses yielded only hints, and the intact ones seldom survived long enough to teach. In that way, the winter kept its secret even as it spent it. Legacy prefers factories to bravado. In plants far from the Ardennes, inspectors who had counted solder joints through magnifiers counted production lots for shipment east. The number that mattered after the battle was not a kill count, but a cadence: how many crates per week, how evenly they reached gun lines that had learned to treat the air like a surface. At depots, a sergeant could sign for boxes of rations and boxes of fuses with the same board signature and know that both would decide days. The novelty was gone. The power remained. There were clean echoes abroad. On islands and seas where the device had first lived, anti-aircraft crews, who already trusted it, fired with a confidence the winter had now taught the artillerymen on land. In later wars, the habit survived. In Korea, bursts hung over gullies and terraced paddies with the same bureaucratic certainty that they had over furs. In training grounds across continents, young officers learned to speak of height of burst, the way their instructors once spoke of deflection, as if the sky were full of invisible shelves you could pull down on a target. If any romance clung to the idea of a radio that decides when to kill, it evaporated in the long years of ordnance manuals and procurement tables. What remained was a simple habit of mind. When a problem can be solved by turning time into fire and fire into air, do so. Memory prefers a sentence it can carry. The observer who had opened this winter by counting flashes closed it by counting the distance between his last safe movement and the first expected bursts, and in that counting he felt not fear but recognition. He wrote his final entries with a hand steadier than the first night and found the line repeating without drama. He did not underline it. He did not give it a date. He did not need to. The battle had inverted an old truth and made it permanent. The ground had not saved you, the air had decided you. When he surrendered his notebook to the depot clerk and walked out under a sky that no longer wore the low lid of snow, the words that had once been shock had become the plainest sort of fact. He had learned them the way a man learns a road in the dark, by touch, by repetition, by consequence. They are bursting over us.